In the restless heartbeat of post-war New York, the streets buzzed with a mix of survival and raw ambition. Men in gray suits marched with purpose, while barefoot kids zigzagged past broken bottles and rusted-out cars. Every corner had its own set of rules, some written, most just whispered. Into this world, on June 11, 1943, Henry Hill was born. He grew up in Brownsville, Brooklyn, a place where poverty and pride shared the same cramped apartments. His father, Henry Hill Sr., was an honest Irish construction worker, a man who believed in the sweat of his brow. His mother, Carmela, was a Sicilian immigrant who held on to faith and hard work as her family's salvation. But young Henry wasn't looking for salvation. He was looking for a sense of belonging. Even as a boy, he felt like the rules of the straight and narrow world just weren't meant for him. From his bedroom window, he had a front-row seat to a different kind of life. He watched the men who didn't play by those rules, the ones in sharp suits, with gold pinky rings that caught the light, who parked their Cadillacs along the curb like personal trophies. They laughed louder, moved with a slow, confident swagger, and never ever seemed to worry about money. To a kid like Henry, they weren't criminals. They were kings. By the time he was just 11 years old, Henry had already made his choice. He would later say, "To me, being a gangster was better than being the President of the United States." And his entry into that world started at a place that wasn't what it seemed. The local cab stand on the corner of Pitt Street was more than just a place to catch a ride. It was the unofficial headquarters for Paul Vario, a captain in the powerful Lucchese crime family. Paulie, as he was known, was a man everyone in the neighborhood respected, or feared. Usually, it was a bit of both. From that small storefront, the real business of the street flowed. Loan sharking, protection rackets, numbers games, and the kind of favors that built legends. Henry started just hanging around, shining shoes, running small errands. While other kids were in school, Henry was getting a different kind of education at the cab stand. He'd deliver mysterious packages, fetch coffee, and park cars, anything to stay close to the action, close to those men. Every day was a lesson in power and loyalty. He saw how the cops would offer a friendly nod as they walked past Paulie's place, how the other kids on the block would instinctively step aside when one of Paulie's crew walked by. It wasn't just fear, it was awe. And soon, the men at the cab stand started to notice him too. They liked this kid. He was polite, quick on his feet, and eager to please. But most importantly, he knew how to keep his mouth shut. That's how it all began. Quietly, almost innocently. A shoe shine here, a package there, a few dollars slipped into his hand for helping out. But in the world of organized crime, small favors have a way of growing into big debts, and every favor comes with a price. Henry's father, the hard-working Irishman who believed in an honest day's pay, started to notice his son's newfound wealth. New shoes, crisp bills in his pocket, even a gold chain glinting under his collar. He demanded to know where it was all coming from. When Henry stayed silent, his father gave him a brutal beating, hoping to scare his son straight. He didn't realize he was only pushing him deeper into the arms of the very world he feared. When Paulie's men found out what had happened, they were not pleased. They paid a visit to the Hill home, not to threaten, not even to argue. They just made it known, quietly but firmly, that Henry was working for them now. From that day on, no one touched him, not his father, not anyone. Henry had found his protection. He had found his real family, his place in the world. By the time he was a teenager, Henry had graduated from running errands to learning the code. It was a simple yet unbreakable set of rules. Don't lie to the wrong people. Don't ever talk to the cops. Don't get greedy. And above all, never, ever rat. The Lucchese family had its own unique system of mentorship, and for Henry, that came in the form of a man named Jimmy Burke, better known as Jimmy the Gent. Jimmy wasn't Italian, which meant he could never be a made man, a full member of the family. But that technicality didn't matter one bit. He was one of the most feared and respected associates in all of New York. Jimmy took Henry under his wing. He taught him the practical skills of the trade, how to hijack trucks, how to move stolen goods, how to make a fortune without leaving a single fingerprint. But Jimmy also taught him something far more dangerous. That charm and confidence could open more doors than violence ever could. Henry watched in amazement as Jimmy would tip a waiter $100 bill for a single drink. buy expensive suits for total strangers, and still command fear from every single person he smiled at. It was power wrapped in a cloak of politeness. And for Henry, it was absolutely intoxicating. This was the life he had dreamed of, and he was finally living it. Flag it down, scare the driver, grab the goods, and vanish. But simple plans have a way of getting complicated. The driver panicked, a shot rang out, and adrenaline surged through Henry's veins. No one was hurt. But that night, holding more cash than his father earned in a month, Henry knew. He was in, all the way in. By the early 1960s, Henry had carved out a space for himself with the Lucchese crime family. He wasn't a made man. His half-Irish blood made sure of that. But he was valuable. He was the guy who could fix a horse race, run a credit scam, or make a problem disappear. He was young, but his name already carried weight in the back rooms and dark alleys of New York. It was then that he met Karen Friedman, a sharp, strong-willed girl from Long Island, who initially wanted nothing to do with him. He was late, arrogant, and cocky on their first date. But there was something else, too. A magnetic blend of danger and confidence that made her feel like she was standing next to someone truly important. Their relationship was a storm of passion, fights, and late-night apologies. They married in 1965, and their wedding was a who's who of mob royalty. Not politicians or CEOs, but capos, soldiers, and enforcers. As Karen later recalled, they had their own kind of glamour. Fur coats, gold watches, and an attitude like they owned the world. And for a while, it seemed like Henry Hill really did own his piece of it. The years that followed were a whirlwind of cash, flashy cars, and whispered deals in smoky lounges. Henry had it all: money, status, and a seat at the table. He was living the dream. But beneath the polished surface, an addiction was taking hold. It wasn't just to drugs or alcohol, but to the life itself, the intoxicating rush of easy money and the feeling of being untouchable. He began to believe the rules didn't apply to him, and in his world, that's the first sign of disaster. By the late 60s, Henry was a key player in nearly every racket the Lucchese crew ran. Hijacking, extortion, gambling, you name it, he had a piece of it. Thousands of dollars flowed through his hands every week, but he spent it just as fast. He indulged in nightclubs, mistresses, and a growing cocaine habit. He and his partner, the infamous Jimmy Burke, were inseparable, constantly looking for the next big score, the one that would set them up for life. And then, it came. The Air France robbery of 1967. An inside tip from a source at JFK Airport revealed a massive security flaw. Huge sums of cash, flown in from France, were being held in an unsecured cargo locker. No guards, no cameras. It was a golden opportunity. Henry assembled a small, trusted crew. They planned every detail with precision. One night, they casually walked into the cargo terminal with a stolen key and walked out with $420,000 in cash, the equivalent of millions today. It was a flawless crime. No one was hurt, and no one was caught. For Henry, this was more than just a payday. It was a statement. It was proof that he could pull off something legendary, something that put him on the same level as the gangsters he'd idolized as a kid. He was no longer the boy shining shoes on the street corner. He was a major player. But with every successful heist and every envelope of cash, the risks grew. The FBI was building a file. The NYPD had him on their radar. And within the family, his success was breeding jealousy and resentment. Henry, however, was too high on his own success to notice. Or maybe he just didn't care. He was too busy enjoying the life he had built from nothing. He had the expensive suits, the luxury cars, and the respect he'd always craved. He had his wife Karen, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and the power that made him feel invincible. What he couldn't see was that the very streets that had made him were now closing in. Because in the world of organized crime, every spectacular rise is destined for an equally spectacular fall. And Henry Hill's fall was only just beginning. The money changed everything. After the Air France job, Henry Hill was no longer just some quiet kid from Brownsville. He had stepped into a world that finally noticed him, and a world where the authorities were starting to take notice too. Cash flowed in faster than he could count it. He bought a Cadillac, sharp suits, and jewelry that caught the glow of New York's streetlights. The city that once seemed so big now felt like his personal stage. But the real achievement wasn't the money itself. It was earning the trust of Paul Vario, the local capo regime. Paulie valued loyalty more than gold, and Henry had just proven his worth. By the early 1970s, Henry was an integral part of a tight-knit circle of highly skilled operators. At the top was Paul Vario, a quiet, calculating leader who planned every move with precision. Then there was Jimmy Burke, known as Jimmy the Gent, a man who was friendly on the surface but was always thinking several steps ahead of everyone else. And of course, Tommy DeSimone, energetic, unpredictable, and utterly fearless when a challenge appeared. Henry was the connector. He was the one who could talk to anyone, gather crucial information, and make things happen on the ground. Together, they organized sophisticated hijacking schemes, ran short-term loan operations, and managed off-the-books betting networks that stretched across the boroughs. They were a well-oiled machine, and for a while, it seemed like nothing could stop them. But for people like them, ambition never stops growing. By 1978, Henry and Jimmy were setting their sights on something bigger than anything they had ever attempted. It would become one of the most talked-about robberies in American history, the Lufthansa heist. It all started with a tip. A worker inside JFK Airport quietly mentioned a massive shipment of untraceable cash arriving from Germany, millions of dollars, stored overnight in a cargo building with surprisingly light security. Henry's role was coordination. He found the right people for the job, meticulously checked the timing, and made sure every single detail fit together perfectly. In the cold, early morning hours of December 11, 1978, the plan unfolded flawlessly. No alarms were triggered, no mistakes were made. It was a masterpiece of planning and precision. When airport workers arrived for their shifts later that morning, they found the vault completely empty. The story exploded nationwide. $5 million gone without a trace. For Henry, it was the ultimate rush, the height of excitement. He had helped pull off the impossible. But a success this bright cast some very long, dark shadows, and this one was already drawing attention from every direction. Trouble was in the air. Within days of the heist, some of the people connected to it started making fatal mistakes. They began showing off their newfound wealth, buying new cars, designer clothes, and flashy jewelry, exactly the kind of attention that nobody needed. Law enforcement, who were already under immense pressure to solve the case, immediately noticed. Newspapers ran speculative stories daily. FBI agents began watching every known associate connected to Henry's circle. Suddenly, the entire atmosphere changed. Old friends became distant. Conversations grew cautious and clipped. And some of the familiar faces from the neighborhood simply disappeared, one by one. What had started as the perfect plan was now carrying a heavy and deadly cost. The late 1970s felt like a blur of endless motion for Henry. Money was pouring in from every direction. Hijacked transport deals, sports wagering, and small investments that never seemed to stop paying out. He even opened his own nightclub, The Suite, a glamorous hotspot where entertainers, entrepreneurs, and street figures all mixed and mingled. From the outside, Henry Hill looked unstoppable, a man who had conquered the city. But beneath the dazzling glow of success, the old foundations of loyalty and silence were beginning to erode. People were chasing bigger profits and breaking the sacred rules that had once held their world together. Henry himself was slipping, becoming dependent on the very drugs he was trading. He kept telling himself he was still in control, but his judgment was blurring with every passing week. Meanwhile, at home, his wife Karen was desperately trying to keep their family life stable. She had always known Henry's world was risky, but she had never realized how deeply it would pull them all in. The constant tension, the frantic late-night calls, the unending gnawing worry. She stayed because she loved him, and because their life together still had moments of genuine joy that felt real. But stability built on secrecy never lasts. Their home was a strange mix of family warmth and quiet, unspoken anxiety. And then, one night, everything changed forever when federal investigators arrived at their door with a search warrant. The double life could no longer stay hidden. For years, federal agents had been meticulously tracing the financial links within the Lucchese crime family. Through extensive wiretaps and financial records, One name kept appearing again and again: Henry Hill. He had become too visible, too successful, too public. And inside his own organization, dangerous murmurs began to spread. Was Henry taking risks that endangered everyone else? Had he crossed lines that should never be crossed? In their world, those questions alone were a death sentence. Paul Vario had always strictly forbidden any involvement with narcotics. They attracted far too much federal heat. But Henry's growing side business in the drug trade directly ignored that rule. He had convinced himself he could handle it, that he was still untouchable. But the signs were everywhere. The system was closing in. It all came to a head in May of 1980. After several sleepless nights, Henry was driving between New York and Pittsburgh, frantically trying to complete one more deal. He didn't know that investigators had been following him for weeks. When they finally made their move, he offered no resistance. Agents searched his home and collected a mountain of evidence that tied him directly to a major narcotics distribution ring. For the first time in his life, Henry felt something completely unfamiliar: total powerlessness. Not because of the police, but because he knew what his own associates would think as soon as they heard the news. In his world, an arrest often meant isolation, and isolation meant you were a target. Sitting in custody, Henry faced an impossible choice. He could remain silent and face decades behind bars, if he even survived long enough to serve the time. Or, he could cooperate with the investigators, protect his family, and lose everything else he had ever known. It wasn't long before he heard that his old friends were furious, and that plans might already be forming to make sure he never testified. The code of silence he had lived by for so long no longer protected him. The FBI offered him a single, life-altering option: enter the Witness Protection Program in exchange for his full and complete cooperation. It was a decision that would send shockwaves through organized crime. Henry Hill, once the loyal associate who dreamed of respect and success, agreed to help the authorities. With that single agreement, his old world vanished in an instant. He became an essential government witness in several major federal cases, providing the kind of inside information investigators had only dreamed of. His testimony was instrumental in dismantling long-standing criminal operations and putting away some of the most powerful men in the mob. But to those he once worked beside, he was now an outsider, a traitor, forever. Everything he had built, the image, the influence, the relationships, was gone. As Henry Hill stepped into witness protection, he finally understood the lesson that would define the rest of his life: power built on fear and secrecy never lasts. For Henry Hill, the real-life figure behind the movie Goodfellas. The end of the film was just the beginning of a different kind of story, one of silence, exile, and a desperate search for an identity he had traded for survival. The day Henry Hill entered the Witness Protection Program, he became a ghost. The vibrant, dangerous world of New York, the backroom deals, the camaraderie, the constant hum of life on the edge, vanished. He, his wife Karen, and their children were spirited away, given new names, new homes, and a single suffocating rule: never speak of the past. Imagine trading the roar of the city for the deafening quiet of suburbia. For a man who thrived on action, the stillness was a prison. He had lived his life being somebody, knowing everyone, commanding respect and fear. Now, he was just another face in the crowd, a nobody. Every introduction was a lie. Every friendly chat a performance. He was alive, but the man he used to be was gone. But you can't erase a past written in headlines and blood. Henry was constantly looking over his shoulder. Every car that slowed down, every stranger's lingering glance, felt like a threat from the life he'd left behind. The feds checked in, reminding him, stay quiet, stay invisible, stay alive. It was a suffocating trade, safety for self. The program provided a lifeline, but it didn't provide a life. The endless cash flow, the tailored suits, the fine dining, all gone. Henry was expected to work a 9-to-5 to live a simple, anonymous life. For a man whose entire existence was built on being larger than life, this was a special kind of hell. He tried to start over, opening small businesses under his new identity. But old habits die hard. The charm that once made him a successful mobster now just made him reckless. And in the quiet moments, the guilt set in. Not just for the friends he betrayed, but for the family he dragged into his personal exile. Karen, who had stood by him through the chaos, was now exhausted by the constant running and hiding. The arguments grew more frequent, the silences heavier. Eventually, she left, taking the children. Henry Hill, who once had everything, was now truly alone. Just when it seemed he would fade into obscurity, the story he tried to bury came roaring back. His testimony led to major convictions, and the press started sniffing around. In 1985, journalist Nicholas Pileggi tracked him down, and the result was the book Wise Guy: Life in a Mafia Family. For the first time, the public saw the inner workings of the mob not through a police report, but through Henry's own eyes. The book was a sensation, a raw, unflinching look at a life of crime. It was a confession, a cautionary tale, and it thrust Henry back into the spotlight he was supposed to be hiding from. Then, in 1990, Martin Scorsese turned Wise Guy into the cinematic masterpiece, Goodfellas. Suddenly, Henry Hill's life was immortalized on the big screen for the world to see. He watched his own story, the glamour, the violence, the inevitable fall, play out in a dark movie theater. It was a surreal experience. People started quoting lines he once said, dressing like him, admiring the swagger of his on-screen persona. But what many missed was the film's true message. Goodfellas wasn't a celebration. It was a warning. It depicted the corrosive nature of greed, the profound loneliness of betrayal, and the ultimate emptiness of a life lived for the next score. Henry himself later admitted that watching the movie felt like seeing a ghost, his own reflection, haunting him from the past. The success of the book and the film gave Henry a strange, paradoxical fame. He was invited on talk shows, gave interviews, and even lectured at colleges. Everyone wanted to meet the real Henry Hill. But the man they were looking for didn't really exist anymore. He was a survivor, a man piecing together a life from the wreckage of his choices. Still, fame is a powerful drug, and Henry, ever the showman, began to enjoy the attention. He hosted radio shows, published a cookbook, the Wise Guy Cookbook, and even sold his own artwork. But every camera flash, every public appearance, was a direct violation of the witness protection rules. He was breaking the one promise that kept him safe. Inevitably, the U.S. Marshals had enough. They officially removed him from the program. The shield was gone. Henry Hill was on his own, completely exposed. As the years went by, a sense of reflection seemed to settle over him. He spoke openly about his mistakes, warning younger generations that a life of crime wasn't freedom. It was a cage built of fear. He explained how the illusion of power had blinded him, how the easy money was a trap that cost him everything that truly mattered. In his later interviews, you could see a man who had outlived his own legend, trying to make sense of it all. By the 2000s, Henry had settled into a quieter life in California. The man who once ran the streets of New York was now on television sharing recipes for marinara sauce. There was a profound irony in it, but also perhaps a kind of peace. He spoke of gratitude for being alive, for escaping a fate that claimed so many of his old associates. He seemed to finally understand that survival itself was a form of redemption. Henry Hill passed away in 2012 at the age of 69. He had lived long enough to watch his life story transform from a scandalous headline into a piece of American history. For all the chaos and regret, he left behind a simple, powerful truth. In his own words, "For as long as I can remember, I wanted to be somebody. But I learned too late that being somebody means knowing who you really are, not who the world thinks you are." The story of Henry Hill didn't end with his death. If anything, it only grew larger, spreading beyond the streets of Brooklyn into classrooms, film studies, and conversations about what it really means to live the American dream. Because Henry's story wasn't just about crime. It was about belonging, identity, and the cost of wanting more than the world was willing to give. He was a man who wanted to matter, and in trying to matter, he lost almost everything that did. When Goodfellas hit theaters in 1990, it redefined how audiences saw organized crime. It wasn't about kings and empires anymore. It was about the middlemen, the ordinary people trying to live extraordinary lives in the shadows. And at the center of it all was Henry Hill, a name that became more than a person. It became a symbol. The movie opened with that unforgettable line, "As far back as I can remember, I always wanted to be a gangster." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a mission statement for a generation of people chasing shortcuts to success. Henry's story spoke to anyone who had ever wanted to escape the ordinary, to rewrite their place in the world. But as the film unfolded, audiences saw what that dream cost: paranoia, betrayal, and a deep, gnawing emptiness. Henry became both a cautionary tale and a mirror, a reflection of the hunger at the heart of the American dream. Over time, the real Henry Hill became a curious kind of celebrity. He was interviewed on the radio, appeared on late-night shows, and even showed up at film festivals where Goodfellas played on the big screen. Audiences were fascinated by the contrast: the soft-spoken man with a weathered face and quiet voice, versus the charismatic, live-wire figure portrayed by Ray Liotta on screen. He would sometimes laugh about it, how people expected the movie version of him to walk into the room. But beneath the humor, there was a profound sadness. He once told a journalist, "That movie made me famous for everything I wish I hadn't done." It was true. The fame he gained was built on the very life he had tried so desperately to escape. As Goodfellas became a cultural landmark, its influence spread far beyond Hollywood. Television shows like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad borrowed heavily from its tone, mixing family, business, and moral collapse into one continuous story. Henry Hill's voice, wry, restless, and self-aware, became the template for a new kind of storytelling, one where heroes and villains blurred into the same person. And yet, that very success raised difficult questions. Did the world remember Henry Hill as a criminal or as a character? Did the story teach people about consequences? Or did it just make them nostalgic for the chaos? It is the paradox of myth-making. The line between a lesson and a legend grows impossibly thin. Even decades later, Henry's name appears in documentaries, essays, and classroom discussions, not as a man to imitate, but as someone to study. He's a real-life reminder of how charm can disguise destruction, and how ambition can quietly become an addiction. In private moments, friends said Henry became more reflective in his later years. He would talk about his old friends, not with hatred, but with a strange, wistful tone. He knew that many of them had not survived the world they helped build. He had outlived almost all of them, but the cost was a deep sense of isolation. He often said he didn't miss the money or the danger. He missed the sense of family, the illusion of belonging, even though he knew it had never been real. That contradiction defined him to the end, grateful to be free, yet haunted by the price of that freedom. Every few years, a new generation discovers Goodfellas. They quote the lines, replay the music, and fall into the rhythm of Scorsese's storytelling. Fast, sharp, and intensely alive. But beyond the entertainment, the message still stands. Power without purpose destroys itself. Loyalty built on fear never lasts, and the chase for status always ends the same way, with someone looking back and wondering where it all went wrong. In that sense, Henry Hill's story is timeless. It's not about crime, it's about human nature. It's about the part of us that wants to matter, even when the cost is far too high. Artists, writers, and filmmakers continue to revisit Henry's story, not to glorify it, but to understand it. He appears in documentaries, memoirs, and podcasts that explore the psychology of risk and the price of ambition. Some people see him as a survivor. Others see him as a warning. Most, I think, see him as both. His life reminds us that transformation is possible, but not always on our own terms. He didn't find redemption through wealth or fame. He found it in small ways, through survival, through admitting what he had done, and living long enough to tell others not to follow the same path. That may not sound like a victory, but in the world he came from, it absolutely was. At its core, Henry Hill's journey is an American story. A man chasing opportunity in all the wrong places. It's a mirror of the country itself. Bold, restless, always wanting more. He was the kid who looked out his window, saw people with power, and thought, "That's the life I want." He didn't see the shadows behind the shine until it was far too late. The dream he chased promised freedom. The life he found gave him chains he couldn't see. And yet, even in his failure, he became part of history. Proof that every rise carries a fall, and every fall carries a lesson. If Henry Hill's life were a movie, the credits would roll not over action or chaos, but over quiet. The hum of a small apartment, the sound of traffic outside, A man stirring coffee in the early morning light. A man who had lived too loudly, finally learning how to live quietly. He once said in an interview, "I'm not proud of what I did, but I'm proud I made it out." That was his truth. Simple, unpolished, and honest. In the end, Henry Hill's story is not about triumph. It's about endurance. It's about how the same drive that builds a life can also tear it apart. And it's about how sometimes the only way to win is to stop running. Henry Hill's life was a map of the choices we all face. Loyalty or truth, belonging or freedom, illusion or reality. He chose all of them at different times and paid for each one. In the end, the man who wanted to be somebody became a story. Not for what he gained, but for what he lost trying to gain it. Maybe that's why his tale still matters, because it reminds us that success built on shortcuts never lasts. And sometimes, survival itself is the truest form of redemption.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology and step deeper into the dark with us.